The Battle of Stalingrad occupies a singular position in modern military history, not because it was the largest battle of the Second World War in isolation, but because it represented the moment when German war machine ceased to be a force capable of decisive victory and became instead an apparatus of managed decline. Stalingrad was not simply a catastrophic defeat, it was a structural rupture. After February 1943, could not fight, Germany could still fight, still kill, still terrorize, but it could no longer win a war of continental scale. The battle exposed the fundamental asymmetries between the Axis and the Soviet Union in manpower, industrial depth, political tolerance for loss, strategic adaptability. It also revealed with brutal clarity how ideology, ego, and symbolic fixation can corrode operational logic and convert a campaign with limited objectives into a self-inflicting annihilation. To understand why Stalingrad mattered, one must begin with the German position in mid-1942. Operation Barbarossa had failed in its core aim to destroy the Red Army in a single campaigning season. Yet it had inflicted catastrophic losses and seized enormous territories. German leadership misinterpreted this partial success as evidence that the Soviet Union was nearing collapse, rather than evidence of its extraordinary absorption capacity. The Wehrmacht entered 1942 exhausted but still operationally superior in maneuver warfare, while Germany's political leadership between that one more decisive blow. Pardon. While Germany's political leadership believed that one more decisive blow would be sufficient to end resistance, this belief hardened into doctrine with the formation and formulation of Case Blue. The German summer offensive aimed primarily at the Caucasus oil fields. Oil, not cities, was the rational objective. Germany's economy and mechanized forces were increasingly constrained by fuel shortages, and seizure of Baku promised not only relief for Germany but strangulation for Soviet war effort. On paper, this was a strategic, coherent plan. Stalingrad entered the picture initially as a supporting objective rather than a decisive one. The city sat astride the Volga River, a vital artery for Soviet internal transport linking the industrial heartland to the south. Disrupting this traffic would complicate Soviet logistics, protect the northern flank of the Caucasus advance. At this stage, Stalingrad was a means, not an end. However, strategy in authoritarian system is rarely immune to symbolism, and here the city name became its curse. Adolf Hitler's fixation on Stalingrad grew not only from military necessity but from a psychological and ideological considerations. A city bearing the name of Joseph Stalin in Hitler's mind was a symbolic target whose capture would humiliate his rival and validate his own narrative of destiny. The transformation of a logistical objective into a prestige target marked the beginning of the German disaster. As the Sixth Army advanced towards Stalingrad in the summer of 1942, early successes reinforced complacency. Soviet forces retreated under pressure, trading space for time in a manner already familiar from the previous years. German commanders, trained to expect collapse after encirclement battles, interpreted these withdrawals as a sign of imminent Soviet disintegration. Yet the Red Army was not collapsing, it was repositioning. Soviet leadership under Stalin pragmatic wartime posture increasingly pragmatic wartime posture had learned from the disasters of 1941. Command structures were streamlined, political interference at the tactical level was reduced, and experienced officers such as Georgy Zhukov were granted operational latitude. The Soviet state had accepted that victory would require catastrophic losses, and it had organized its economy and society accordingly. Urban combat at Stalingrad rapidly negated Germany's traditional advantages. The Wehrmacht excelled in combined arms maneuver warfare across open terrain, where armor, artillery, and air power could be coordinated with devastating efficiency. Stalingrad destroyed this environment. Rubble choked streets, limited tank movement, buildings provided endless defensive positions, and engagement collapsed into brutal, close quarters fighting, measured in meters rather than kilometers. Soviet defenders deliberately hugged German lines, minimizing the effectiveness of German artillery and airstrikes by forcing combat into intimate proximity. What emerged was not a battle of maneuver but a battle of attrition, something Germany was structurally ill equipped to fight. The German leadership failed to, re- failed to recognize the strategic implications of this transformation. Instead of reassessing objectives once Stalingrad became a grinding urban struggle, Hitler doubled down. Reinforcements were fed into the cities piecemeal, not to achieve decisive breakthrough but to prevent symbolic loss. The Sixth Army became trapped not by Soviet encirclement initially but by its own mission creep. Every additional battalion committed increased sunk cost and made withdrawal politically unthinkable. Retreat, once a legitimate operational tool in German doctrine, was framed by Hitler as weakness bordering on treason. Orders hardened into absolutes. Stalingrad was to be taken, and once partially taken, it had to be held at all costs. When German attention fixated on the city itself, Soviet planners focused elsewhere. They correctly identified the vulnerability not at the urban front but along the extended German flanks. To sustain the drive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously, German forces had been split into Army Group A and Army Group B, diluting strength across vast distances. Even more critically, Germany relied on Allied formations, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian troops, to guard its flanks. These units were under-equipped, poorly supplied, and acutely vulnerable to armored assaults. This was not an unforeseen risk. German commanders were aware of their allies' limitations, but strategic overreach left no alternative. The Wehrmacht had gambled that the Red Army lacked the capacity to exploit these weaknesses. That gamble proved fatal. Operation Uranus, launched in November 1942, was not a tactical miracle, but a methodical application of operational art. Soviet forces avoided the strongest German positions and struck precisely where defenses were weakest. Armored and mechanized units punched through Allied lines north and south of Stalingrad, driving rapidly towards the rear of the Sixth Army within days. German forces in the city were encircled. This was not a sudden reversal of fortune, but a culmination of months of misaligned priorities and neglected risks. The encirclement exposed the ultimate flaw in the German strategy: an army optimized for rapid victory but incapable of sustained survival once immobilized. At this point, the fate of the Sixth Army hinged on a single decision: whether to attempt a breakout. Many German commanders recognized that immediate withdrawal offered the only chance of preserving combat power. Supplies within the pocket were insufficient, winter conditions were worsening, Soviet forces were consolidating their ring, yet Hitler categorically forbade retreat. He assured his generals that the Luftwaffe could sustain the encircled army by air until a relief force arrived. This assertion was detached from logistical reality. The volume of supplies required far exceeded airlift capacity, particularly under winter conditions and Soviet air pressure. Nevertheless, the order stood. Obedience replaced analysis. The airlift exactly failed as mathematics predicted it would. Starvation, exposure, and ammunition shortages crippled the Sixth Army's ability to fight. Meanwhile, the promised relief effort, Operation Winterstorm, lacked sufficient strength to break through the Soviet defenses. German forces advanced partway towards Stalingrad, but they were halted by determined Soviet resistance and counterattacks. With each passing week, the possibility of a breakout diminished further. The encircled army became a static mass of exhausted men, slowly consumed by cold, hunger, and artillery fire. Leadership within the pocket fragmented as command authority became symbolic rather than functional. The final phase of the battle was less a military engagement than a process of liquidation. Soviet forces reduced the pocket methodically, dividing it into smaller segments and destroying them in sequence. German resistance, though often desperate and courageous at the tactical level, had no strategic meaning left. By January 1943, the outcome was inevitable. Field Marshal Frederick Paulus, promoted at the last moment in a transparent attempt to pressure him into suicide or continued resistance, instead surrendered. The destruction of the Sixth Army was complete. An entire field army had been eliminated not through battlefield annihilation alone, but through the accumulation of strategic errors. The consequences of Stalingrad extended far beyond the immediate loss of manpower. Psychologically, it shared the myth of German invincibility for the first time. A German field army had been destroyed in its entirety, and the defeat could not conceal or reframe a temporary setback. Axis allies, already wavering, began assessing their commitments. Within Germany, public morale suffered a blow from which it never fully recovered. The war, shift, the war shifted perceptibly from defensive ambitions to offensive necessities. From this point onwards, Germany would fight primarily to delay defeat rather than to secure victory. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad represented both validations and transformations. It confirmed that the Red Army had mastered the operational art necessary to defeat Germany and that Soviet industry, manpower, and political control could sustain losses on an unprecedented scale. Yet the victory was purchased at an ordinary cost. Casualties numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and entire formations were expended in the process. The Soviet state accepted these losses at the price of survival and supremacy. Unlike Germany, it had prepared itself psychologically and materially for a war of exhaustion. This asymmetry revealed that Stalingrad would define the remainder of the Eastern Front. From a broader analytical perspective, Stalingrad demonstrates the limit of tactical excellence in the absence of strategic coherence. German soldiers often fought with skill and determination, but their efforts were squandered by decisions made far above their level. The battle also illustrates how authoritarian command structure can amplify failure by suppressing dissent and enforcing conformity. Once Hitler defined Stalingrad as a symbol, rational adjustment became politically impossible. In contrast, the Soviet system, despite its brutality, demonstrated a capacity for learning and adaptation once the initial shock of Barbarossa had passed. This flexibility combined with sheer scale proved decisive. Urban warfare lessons drawn from Stalingrad remain relevant even today. Cities favor defenders, absorb firepower, and prolong conflict. They punish attackers who lack secure supply lines and exit strategies. Stalingrad shows that once an attacker becomes emotionally or politically invested in holding urban terrain, the city ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a death trap. Modern military doctrine reflects these lessons beautifully, emphasizing isolation bypasses and containment rather than frontal urban conquests whenever possible. Yet the temptation to seize symbolic city persists, making Stalingrad a cautionary case rather than a closed chapter. Ultimately, Stalingrad was not a mistake but a chain of interlocking failures rooted in overconfidence, ideological rigidity, and misreading of the enemy. Germany lost not because it lacked capable soldiers or commanders, but because it misjudged the nature of the war it was fighting. The Soviet won not because it possessed superior tactics alone, but because it aligned with strategy, economy, and political will towards a single objective survival at any bloody cost. When these two approaches collided on the banks of Volga, the outcome was brutal and decisive. Stalingrad marked the moment when the Second World War in Europe became, in strategic terms, a war Germany could no longer win.